It's cold here today. It's only in the 40s. I got a torpedo heater in here. I just shut it down temporarily. But on this trailer here, what we're going to be doing is a starter board. The reason they call that is because it starts at the wall and moves forward towards the middle of the trailer. And on these starter boards, one end is normally flat like that. On these 53 footers, most of the time I have seen these starter boards being 13 inches wide, where the center boards, all the other boards in between the two starter boards, are usually only 12 inches wide. As I just showed you, one end is flat, the other end has a step here. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to cut out this starter board. I have to find the tape measure. I got it here somewhere. But as you can see, there's a hole right there. And the starter board isn't all that great up a little ways. And right there is another hole. So we're going to be coming up past this hole. Now, I got 12 feet of starter board. And I'm going to go ahead and start at that end to cut it out. And what I usually do is I look at the screws and I figure out where the cross members are, and I cut in between the two cross members this way. And then however long I'm going to make the board, I cut at 90 degrees from that line all the way to the end wherever I'm going to stop. And then once I get those squares cut out, they pretty much usually drop out. And then I wound up using a hammer and chisel to get the remaining wood out. And I'm going to show you that process here in steps. And this is going to take a few hours, so I'm not going to videotape it the whole way through. I'm going to show you step by step. Right now, we've already swept the floor, and there's what's called a threshold plate at the back of the trailer. And they're made out of metal, and the reason for them is when you back into a dock and they put the dock plate down, it goes down on the threshold plate instead of the wood, and that's to help keep the dock plates from digging into the wood and destroying the wood. The metal is a bit thick, and it will take a lot more abuse of the dock plates hitting it, the forklifts banging the dock plates against it instead of it doing it against the wood. And we got a brand new threshold plate to put on here. It's going to come in a lot further than the old one. You can see where the old one stopped right here. I don't know exactly where, but I'm thinking the new threshold plate's probably going to come back to somewhere in here. And I know some of you are thinking, well, why don't you just put a threshold plate down? Well, remember, I showed you the hole back up in here, and this makes this entire board weak up until some point up there where I'm going to cut it. And I don't want a forklift falling through it. This trailer has to go get a load Monday. Today's only Wednesday, so I got plenty of time to replace this board. But I'm going to do that today and hopefully get it all done today, because all I got to do is cut this board out, lay the other one in, drill the holes, and put the floor screws in. You want to use floor screws because the heads are tapered and it pulls the wood back down. And what I'll more than likely do is where the threshold plate goes, I won't put any screws in the new board, for the simple reason when I drill down through the new threshold plate, through the wood and into the cross member, they'll pull everything down. You really don't need screws underneath the threshold plate holding the wood. The factory may do that because the factory puts all the wood in, and then another person may be the one putting the threshold plates in. I'm not sure how the factory does it. That's a guess on my part. But more than likely, the factory probably puts the screws in the wood and then later on puts the threshold plate in. One unique problem with starter boards is you can't get right up against the wall. And when you get the rest of the board out, You just have to use whatever you have. Whatever you have to cut the rest of the board out. I have a reciprocating saw. I'm going to use it some. I'm going to use it as much as I can, and then I'm going to chisel the remaining part that goes up against the wall. But if you're doing an intermediate board, you don't have that problem because you can get right there along the edge of the board, so it's a lot easier. This is one of the reasons I hate doing starter boards, but I don't have a choice on this one. It has to get done. And there's one more thing you gotta be careful about when you're working close to what some people call a top hat. It's a metal channel that if you set it down, it looks like a stove, one of those stove top or stovepipe hats like President Lincoln wore. And what runs in that, if you have one of these, is all the wiring for your tail lights and such for the back of the trailer, and up there in the middle of the trailer, your middle turn signals and marker lights there also, and depending on the trailer, your clearance lights on top of the trailer could run in there and then run up the back to the lights, or another type is they run them straight up from the 7-way at the front of the trailer up to the marker lights and then back. But you don't want to cut that because, like I said, your wiring is in it and it has a lip that the starter board sits on, so you don't want to cut that metal. Plus, it would dull your blade too. Now, every time I turn the GoPro on, I shut the heater off so you can hear me. On these boards, the reason the boards look clean every time I show you the board is I sweep it up before I turn the GoPro back on also. Once you get your lengthy cuts made, I always just go at a 90-degree in between the cross members and then knock that out and then work with the wood that's on top of the cross members. I know some people will actually go from one cross member and make an X and knock it out that way. Whichever way you want to do it is fine. They both work. For me, I've discovered for myself that it's easier for me to just make a lot more of those cuts, to cut the wood out in between the cross members, because then I can get underneath there and see exactly where the cross member is and work with it that way. But if you want to make an X, or heck, you want to make a circle, or however you want to cut the wood out, that's fine. Once I get all this wood out, the screws that hold the wood in, sometimes if you take your bit, these are a T40, sometimes if you take your bit and you clean the head of the screw out, put the bit in there and hit it with a hammer, sometimes you can use an impact and pull the screws out. I already tried that on all these screws. It did not work. I didn't get one of them out. So what I'm going to do is, once I get all this wood out, whatever screws are remaining, I will take a grinder with a cutoff blade. I used to use a panel cutter with a blade to cut them off, and I always had to have air in that. But I upgraded to battery operated tools. So it's easier for me to just use a battery operated grinder and cut all those screws off. And you want to cut them as flush as you can, because if you don't, the remaining part of the screw is going to give you a problem putting the new board, not bolt. So you want to get them flush. You want to clean all the bad wood out of there. And I'll show you when I get to that point. Okay, I got all the cutting with the circular saw done. Sometimes, if you're lucky, when you have these little pieces like this, you still got to get out. If you hit them with a hammer, like this one here, most of it might come out just like that. And then you got this piece that the screws around, and sometimes when you take a hammer and you hit it, sometimes if you're lucky, it'll break off of there. You don't have to use a wood chisel to get it off. Now, I do have wood chisels that when they don't come off like that, that I use to cut around the screw or cut by the screw to split the wood to get it off. As far as getting these out, like I told you earlier, I just use a grinder with a cutoff wheel. And today I'm actually hanging on to the screws with a pair of pliers when I cut it. And the reason I'm doing this is because where I'm doing this at is all leaves and dirt and that. Normally, if I'm on concrete or blacktop, I'll just let them fall on the ground and I'll sweep them up after I get done. But being that they would be almost impossible to find in this dirt with all the leaves, I've been hanging on to them with a pair of pliers so I can actually get them. Here's a piece that don't want to come out by just hitting it with a hammer, and it still has a screw in it. And I said about using a wood chisel, and what I normally do is I find the screw and then I try and line up with the screw on the wood and split it, and then normally it just comes right off. Here's another little trick that I do when I have the board out and ready to go back in. Now you can always line up with the screws that are already in the adjacent board, but seeing how a threshold plate has to go down, this is also another reason I did this, is if you can see the marks I put on the wall and on the top hat, I marked each side of the cross member. So I know right where the cross member is, and when I go to lay the threshold plate down, I'm not going to be able to see the screws that are in the floor to be able to tell where the cross member is to bolt across the threshold plate down. So I need some kind of reference once the threshold plate's down, because I'm not putting any screws in the new board that are going to be under the threshold plate. Only out of the threshold plate, because when I drill through the threshold plate to put the screws in over top of the new wood, I'm going to be going down through the new wood and into the cross member. So that's all going to hold the new board down also. And then I'll have all the other screws also holding it down. Okay, I got the board down in here. Now, once I got it down in where it belonged, remember on these starter boards, they go into a channel on the wall, and then they drop down. Now what I do with the screws that I'm using, I use a 17/64 drill bit, and then I find the cross member, which I already marked. I got it on the wall, and I marked it on here, right beside the board and on the wall, so I can actually line up on the cross member without trying to guess. So I find that you don't want to go to the center of the cross member, because that's where the vertical part is. You want to go off center, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm trying not to miss the cross member, but I'm not trying to hit the center either. So I drill with a 17/64 drill bit. That's the cross member. Somebody that does a lot more flooring than I do once told me to use antifreeze or coolant. Once you drill through the wood, go ahead and put a significant amount of antifreeze in there to help keep the drill bit cool and keep you from breaking it. And once you get the 17/64 drill bit down through, then you can put the floor screw in. And I use a 1/2-inch drive impact. This is all battery operated, by the way. And when I put the screw down in, and then after you get all the screws you want in there, then you put the threshold plate in. And these marks that I put in here on the floor ain't going to help, but on the wall it will, to tell me where the cross member is once I put the threshold plate in. Threshold plate is not wanting to play nice. Sides drop down in. This side doesn't want to drop in. So we're going to give it a little bit of gentle persuasion. It's probably bowed, and that's why I don't want to go in, but we'll just keep tapping on it with the sledgehammer until it drops in. And then basically same thing that I did with the board as far as putting the screws in. I got all these marks where those old screws are. I don't know if you can see them, and where the cross members are. I have a chalk line that I'm going to go ahead and utilize so I know where the cross members are, and then I'll just make sure that I don't hit any of those old screws. That's why I marked it at the very back. All those marks there are where the old screws are from that actually broke off and didn't come out, or I had to cut off. I appreciate you watching the video. There's no sense of me showing you drilling through here and putting screws in like I did on the board. So I appreciate you watching the video, and please come back and subscribe and hit that bell button so YouTube knows that you like the videos. Thank you.